We're going to talk about Esther and why Esther was chosen to replace Vashti and why it was necessary for the kingdom in that nation to be restored from what was in Vashti, which was ripping apart the kingdom. So this is really interesting because if you study the book of Esther, you begin to see why it was that Esther herself, what was inside of her, had to have been cultivated. It was what was in her spiritually was necessary to break the strongholds of what Vashti had brought into the kingdom. So when you have a leader that has a spirit like Vashti, it releases hell and it affects the whole ship. The whole kingdom starts getting infiltrated by the influence of that mindset and that spirituality. And she had to be removed because it was destroying the kingdom. And that was God. So the king's hearts are in the hand of the Lord and he turns them. So that evil spirituality that was destroying the kingdom, I mean, because that's what the guy said. They acknowledged it. They're like, we have got to get her out of here because it's that is going to cause all the women to despise their husbands and be in rebellion. So that spirituality and nature in her, and it already was, because she already wasn't with her husband. She was already doing all this stuff with the lady. She was already drawing all the women away from honoring their husband and being their helpmeet. Right? She's like, we're going to do our own thing over here. So that spirituality was already working. It just came to the front and the fruition of the clarity just came into the light in a more clear way. And that was when the decision was made. Esther had something very different in her that had been cultivated ever since she was little. So Mordecai took her up. She was an orphan from her parents. She had a Mordecai. Thank you, God, for the Mordecais that take up ones who are spiritually orphaned, even if their parents are still alive. They are like Ruth's, and they cleave onto a Naomi, and there is a Mordecai in the house. And they come under that, and they begin to humble themselves and learn to cultivate what was in Esther. So Esther was trained under Mordecai to honor authority. So that is who she was on the inside. So she looked to Haggai when she could have had all the jewels from whatever, to put on for her one night for the king. And she only wore what the leader, Haggai, she went to him and she asked him, what should I wear for the king? And she only wore what he said. She did what Mordecai said. She pleased the king. I believe she was chosen by God because the altar of consecration, of humility under authority, God had found that a strong enough altar to break what had been established to destroy the kingdom from the altar that was in Vashti of rebellion. So God had, when there's a Vashti, at a top level, whether it's in a church, in authority, in a kingdom, God is looking around for someone with the heart of Esther. Is there anyone I can find that will consecrate an altar stronger than what's the wickedness that's being released right here, that I can begin to set apart and set up so it can break that thing? Because that is then affects the entire spirituality of the whole kingdom, whether it's a nation, whether it's a church house, whatever it is. But that evil spirituality, until that Esther is brought in, it's still affecting the whole ship. Marriages are being messed up. There's stuff that's just not okay because that spirit is, the effects of that is still there. It could be years later. I mean, but God had to find someone that had an altar of consecration in a humble place of yielding under authority, that she would do what she was asked to do before God, but also under the authority that God had appointed. so that God could send her to heal the kingdom. Really, to heal the kingdom, to heal the king and heal the kingdom. This is what this is all about. It's absolutely amazing. And that is why it says in Esther 2:15, Esther, she required nothing. You know, when it was her turn to go before the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the woman, appointed. And she obtained favor. And then verse 20, Esther had not yet shown her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. So here's what I know. When God begins to set someone apart, to cultivate a spirit, you know, of Esther, and they leave everything, and they'll cleave to a Naomi, and they're under some Mordecai's, and God is cultivating something in them that might be very different than the spirituality of their generations. But they're like Rahab and like Ruth. They're like, get me out of here. I'm going with you. And they'll cleave to that. And God is looking then to first, in that woman, to overthrow what's in her generations. And what's wild is that it's amazing to me that God could take someone that would be the absolute seemingly last choice because of what was working in their life before that, or what was working in their generations before that. But because they had that act of, I'm going with you, I'm Ruth, you're my Naomi, I'm going with you, and coming under the Mordecai's, and be like, it might be really messed up, it might look really messed up, but we're gonna consecrate this thing, God, we're gonna get this thing, I'm gonna go with you, and as low as I need to go, that's where my heart is, and God sees the heart. That's what I love about our Father. He doesn't look at the outside. So whereas it might look so messy in the journey, but God sees a heart that has been broken, and he is gonna get that thing worked out. And that is where the heart of Esther gets formed. So then he can bring that in because he understood what in the generations was working that was against that. And he understood what level of overthrowing that happened in that person's heart. And this is where the power of God gets released, because it's in the greatest areas of our weakness, of our, generational hell and iniquity, that God's power is released the strongest. So the Esther that he might find might be someone who's coming from some serious generational witchcraft hell. But because they have left and cleaved and gone through this process, God's like, I've got an Esther. And when I ask her to do something, well, sometimes it might take her a little time, but she's going to get it. And I'm forming in her this, just like I've been doing. Under the Mordecai, she might not get it, she might not have gotten it, whatever. But this is what God needed, and that's why Esther was chosen. It was necessary, what was in her was necessary to be brought into the kingdom for that time, to heal that king and to heal the kingdom, restore marriages, restore life, restore women to being women and honoring and loving their husband, and heal the hearts of the men by being honored by their women. And, it's from the top down, healing the king. So, and that's why she had favor with him, because there was something in her, whether he knew it or not, there was something in her that was so different than what he'd experienced in the past, that's why he loved her, I believe. He touched something that was so beautiful and different than what he'd been broken and destroyed by in the past. That stuff breaks a man. Levels of dishonor and rebellion in the home, it just starts stripping the men of their manhood, of their just destiny, of their, it just breaks up a man. So men are really created to be just honored and treated with just honor and dignity and respect. And anything other than that really breaks down a man. I can look at a man. I can see in a man. I look at a man and it's a strong man of God. I'm like, I want to meet his wife because I know that she's cultivating a place of honor, because that man of God would not be able to do what he's doing if she's ripping him apart at home. I know it. Men can love their wives, but it is really, really hard. When I look at some men, I can tell that some's not right. And the women can look beautiful and fabulous, but there's something that's breaking down that man, and I can see it. So God so wants to restore us back to the purity and the holiness of marriage, and with the heart of Esther, that we all would have that cultivated in our hearts. And there's processes that God will lead us to he knows the things in our lives that might be keeping us from that. And he might ask us to do levels of sacrifice and obedience that will cultivate that greater and establish that in our own hearts and lives. So may God form that in us together as a church under his authority, and individually for the gifts and callings that he has uniquely, specifically for each of us. God bless you.